The valley was already changing when Bor noticed the first frost clinging to the edges of the tall grass. The air had grown sharper, colder, and thinner, and the breath from his nostrils came out as small white clouds. The trees had started to shed their golden leaves, and the herds that once roamed freely through the valley now moved in slow, cautious patterns toward the lowlands. Bor stood on a ridge, wrapped in fur, watching the movement below with quiet awareness. He knew what it meant. Winter was coming, and with it came hunger. Unlike the beasts, he couldn't migrate far. His life, his fire, and his memories were rooted in this valley. He had survived many winters before, but each one carried new challenges. The land never offered the same gifts twice. Food was no longer something found easily. The berries had withered. The roots grew deeper and harder to dig, and the small streams that once glittered with fish had turned to dull, icy veins. Bor's stomach growled in protest, but his mind stayed calm. Survival wasn't about panic. It was about rhythm. He walked along the edge of the forest, spear in hand, eyes scanning for signs. A broken branch, fresh tracks, the faint smell of fur in the wind. Every sense sharpened, as if the cold itself awakened something ancient inside him. He remembered how his father once said that hunger teaches faster than any elder. Now, alone, Bor would learn again what the earth allowed a man to take, and what it demanded in return. His first hunt of the season was not for glory but necessity. Bor crouched in the shadows of a fallen pine, watching a family of hares nibble at frozen moss. Their fur was thick and white, perfect camouflage against the snow patches. He waited, patient as stone, until one wandered too far from the burrow. The throw of his spear was swift and silent. The creature fell without a sound. When Bor lifted it, he whispered a quiet thanks, a ritual that had become instinct. Every kill carried weight. Each meal was a bargain with life itself. He roasted the hare slowly over a small fire, the fat sizzling on the stones, the smell mixing with pine smoke. It wasn't a feast, but it was warmth, strength, and hope in one bite. As the days shortened, Bor began to gather not just food, but wisdom. He learned which plants could last when buried under snow, dried mushrooms hidden beneath bark, nuts stored in hollow logs, roots kept near the warmth of his fire. He studied the habits of animals, noticing where wolves hid their kills and how foxes buried leftovers. The land spoke if one knew how to listen. Bor's cave soon smelled of smoke and salt. He hung strips of meat above his fire, curing them with patience, turning flesh into endurance. It was slow, careful work, and sometimes loneliness pressed harder than hunger. Yet in the silence, he found rhythm again, the beating heart of survival. One evening, as snow began to fall in thick, soft flakes, Bor sat outside his cave, chewing on dried meat, watching the valley turn white. It wasn't fear he felt anymore, but a kind of deep respect for the cold, the hunger, and the creatures that faced it with him. He saw a wolf in the distance, its breath rising like smoke. For a brief moment, their eyes met, predator and man, both bound by the same law of survival. The fire behind him crackled. The wind hummed through the cliffs, and Bor knew. This winter would not be easy, but neither was he. The days passed into weeks, and Bor's world shrank into the rhythm of survival. Hunt, fire, rest, and watch. The valley that had once been filled with movement was now a silent expanse of snow and wind. Each sound mattered. The creak of a frozen tree, the faint crackle of a nearby stream, the distant howl of wolves hunting in packs. Food became both his purpose and his teacher. He learned to trap smaller creatures using twisted vines and sharpened sticks. He carved hooks from bone to fish through ice, and sometimes he gnawed on frozen roots when no creature crossed his path. Each bite was a memory of struggle, a reminder that life itself was earned, not given. His muscles ached from cold, but his will burned hotter than his fire. Bor began to notice patterns that only hunger could teach. When the snow crust hardened, the hares ran deeper into the thickets. When the moon grew bright, the deer crossed the valley's edge in search of bark to chew. He moved with the land's rhythm, studying it like scripture. At night, he sat by the fire, eating slowly, conserving every morsel. Sometimes he mixed melted snow with crushed pine needles for tea, bitter but warming. Other times, he boiled bones for hours to drink the rich broth, a golden elixir that kept his strength alive. Each method was a discovery, a rediscovery of what the earth offered when everything seemed taken. His cave became both kitchen and sanctuary, the walls blackened with soot, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and survival. Yet hunger is a ghost that never leaves. Even as Bor ate, it lingered behind his ribs, whispering. One stormy night, the wind screamed like a living thing. Snow poured endlessly, blinding the valley and burying the world outside. For 3 days, Bor was trapped inside the cave, the fire's only friend. He rationed his dried meat, slicing thin strips with careful precision, chewing slowly to trick his body into fullness. When even that began to run out, he looked around, at bones, bark, anything that could give energy. He boiled the remaining marrow, scraping every last trace of life from the leftovers. Survival was no longer about strength, but cleverness. And in that blizzard howl, Bor began to understand the quiet wisdom of scarcity. The fewer the choices, the more sacred each becomes. When the storm broke, the valley looked reborn, but in a harsh, frozen beauty. Trees glittered with ice. The world shone like crystal, deadly and magnificent. Bor ventured out, weak but determined. The cold bit his face, but his spirit didn't waver. He found the frozen carcass of a deer, half buried beneath snow, perhaps killed by wolves days earlier. It was a treasure, not just meat but hide, bone, and sinew. He dragged it back to his cave, sweating despite the chill. With a stone blade, he worked slowly, separating each part with reverence. He cooked what he could, smoked what remained, and used the hide to reinforce the cave entrance. In that single act, he gained weeks of life. To others, it might have been luck. To Bor, it was a conversation with nature answered in silence. The deeper winter grew, the more Bor relied on instinct rather than memory. He began to store food underground, in pits lined with snow and moss to keep it fresh. He learned that frozen meat could last longer if rubbed with ash. He used animal fat as both fuel and food, melting it in small stones to cook his remaining roots. Nothing was wasted, not even bones, which he crushed into powder to thicken broth. This resourcefulness wasn't born of intelligence alone, but humility. Every discovery came from failure first. Each time he burned food or lost meat to scavengers, he learned a better way. By now, his body had changed, lean, scarred, his face hardened by wind and wisdom. Yet behind those eyes burned something eternal, a quiet gratitude for being alive another day. Sometimes, Bor would dream of warmer times, of green meadows and summer rains. He remembered the sweet taste of fresh berries and the crack of roasted nuts. But when he woke, there was only snow and stone. Those dreams, though distant, gave him hope. They reminded him that the earth never forgets its seasons. Warmth would come again. To survive, he began to think ahead, not just of the next meal, but the next moon, the next thaw. He placed markers near hunting trails, memorizing where animals had food or made dens. In his solitude, he became both hunter and historian, mapping his world not with ink, but with footsteps and scars. As winter reached its cruelest point, Bor faced the hardest truth. Sometimes, there is nothing left to eat. For days, the valley went silent. No tracks, no movement, no sound except the whispering wind. He chewed on pine bark and melted snow for sustenance. His body weakened, but his spirit did not bend. In those quiet, desperate hours, he remembered his ancestors, those who had endured worse, who had passed down this stubborn spark of life. Eat the earth, his father had once said, for it feeds you even when it looks empty. Bor took that to heart. He dug into the frozen soil and found roots, thin and bitter, but enough. Each bite reminded him that survival isn't about plenty. It's about persistence. Then one morning, the first sign of change came. A crow landed near his cave, a scavenger, yes, but also a messenger. The snow had softened overnight. Bor stepped outside, feeling the air different, not warm yet, but alive. The streams were whispering beneath their icy shells, and far in the distance, he saw movement. Deer returning to the lower slopes. His heart stirred. He prepared his spear, not with desperation, but calm focus. The world was waking again. The hunger that had defined his winter began to fade, replaced by something else. Understanding. He realized that hunger was not his enemy. It was his teacher. It had stripped away illusion, leaving only truth, that life feeds on balance, not abundance. In the weeks that followed, Bor's cave filled once again with the smells of roasting meat and burning wood. He hunted sparingly, taking only what was needed, always offering silent thanks to the earth. His strength returned, but so did his humility. He no longer saw himself as master of the valley, but as part of its endless cycle, birth, hunger, death, and renewal. One evening, as the sun sank and painted the snow in crimson light, he sat outside, eating slowly. Each bite was no longer about survival. It was a communion. The wind was softer now, and somewhere far off, water laughed through thawing ice. By the time spring touched the valley, Bor was not the same man who had entered winter. His body bore the marks of struggle, but his heart carried peace. He had eaten the world in all its forms, meat, root, bark, in silence, and in doing so he had tasted truth. The earth had fed him not only food but wisdom, that to survive is to listen, to respect, to take only what the moment allows. As the snow melted and grass returned, Bor stood at the mouth of his cave, the wind brushing his face. He smiled faintly, knowing another winter would come one day, and when it did, he would be ready not just to endure it, but to understand it. The valley was alive again, and so was he.